There's something most people never realize about narcissistic relationships. The narcissist didn't actually need you loved, they needed you confused. Because confused people are easier to control. And once you understand that, so many painful moments suddenly start making sense. The mixed signals, the inconsistency, the emotional highs followed by emotional distance, the moments they acted loving right after hurting you. None of that was random. Confusion was part of the system. Because confusion keeps people emotionally engaged. When things are clear, people make decisions. But when things are emotionally inconsistent, people stay stuck trying to understand. And that's exactly where narcissists want you. In analysis, in uncertainty, in emotional imbalance. Because emotionally balanced people are harder to manipulate. But emotionally confused people, they stay attached. They replay conversations, question themselves, search for meaning constantly. And that search creates emotional dependency. That's why narcissistic relationships often feel psychologically exhausting. Your brain never fully relaxes. You're always trying to decode something. What they meant, what changed, why they suddenly became cold, why they suddenly became affectionate again. And that unpredictability is what keeps the attachment alive. Because uncertainty creates obsession. That's something narcissists understand instinctively, even if they're not consciously planning every behavior. They learn quickly that inconsistency creates emotional power. Because when affection becomes unpredictable, attention becomes addictive, and addiction, it's much stronger than healthy attachment. That's why people stay emotionally trapped for so long. Not because the relationship consistently felt good, but because the emotional confusion created psychological dependency. And this next part is where people start losing themselves completely. Because eventually, you stop trusting your own emotional reality. At first, you notice the inconsistencies clearly. The contradictions, the manipulation, the emotional instability. But over time, constant confusion weakens self-trust, especially when the narcissist alternates between affection and emotional withdrawal constantly. Because now, your nervous system stops focusing on truth. It starts focusing on emotional survival. How do I get things back to normal? How do I stop the distance? How do I make them loving again? And once you reach that point, the narcissist no longer needs complete control. Your confusion maintains the cycle automatically. That's why emotional inconsistency is so powerful psychologically. Because the brain naturally seeks resolution. Humans struggle tolerating unresolved emotional tension. So when someone constantly alternates between warmth and coldness, your brain becomes obsessed with restoring emotional certainty. And narcissists often reinforce that cycle repeatedly. Distance, affection, withdrawal, validation, confusion, relief, again and again. Until emotional instability becomes your normal. And once instability becomes normal, healthy consistency starts feeling unfamiliar. That's how deep the conditioning becomes. But here's the disturbing part. The narcissist often sees your confusion as emotional attachment. Because confusion keeps you emotionally focused on them, thinking about them constantly, trying to understand them constantly, reacting emotionally constantly. And emotional focus feels like power to narcissists. That's why clarity threatens the dynamic so deeply. Because clarity breaks emotional dependency. The moment things become emotionally obvious, the cycle weakens. That's why narcissists rarely communicate clearly during manipulation phases. Instead, They create emotional ambiguity, half-truths, mixed signals, contradictory behavior. Because ambiguity keeps you emotionally engaged longer, and emotionally engaged people are easier to influence. This is also why so many narcissistic relationships feel impossible to explain to other people. Because confusion doesn't translate clearly. You know something feels wrong emotionally, but you can't fully organize it logically. And that uncertainty keeps you trapped internally. Especially when the narcissist occasionally becomes deeply affectionate again. Because those moments create emotional hope. And hope becomes dangerous inside inconsistent relationships. Because now, you're no longer attached to what the relationship actually is. You're attached to what it temporarily becomes. That's why people often say, but when things were good, they were really good. And that statement reveals the entire cycle, because healthy love doesn't depend on rare moments of emotional relief. Healthy love creates emotional safety consistently. But narcissistic dynamics often create emotional starvation, followed by temporary emotional reward and intermittent reward. Create some of the strongest psychological conditioning possible. That's why leaving feels so difficult. Not because the relationship was emotionally stable, because your brain became conditioned around unpredictability. And unpredictable affection creates emotional obsession. But this next phase is where confusion becomes even more destructive. Because eventually, you start blaming yourself for the instability. You assume, if I communicated better, if I were calmer, if I loved them differently, maybe things wouldn't feel this confusing. And once self-blame begins, the narcissist gains even more emotional control. Because now, you stop questioning the pattern, and you start questioning yourself. That shift changes everything psychologically. Because self-doubt weakens boundaries. It weakens perception. It weakens emotional certainty. And emotionally uncertain people become easier to manipulate repeatedly. That's why narcissists often react strongly when you suddenly become emotionally clear, because clarity interrupts the cycle. The moment you stop over-explaining, stop chasing emotional resolution, stop analyzing every mixed signal, their influence weakens dramatically, and narcissists feel that shift immediately. That's why many narcissists suddenly become intensely emotional, right when you begin emotionally detaching. Because emotional detachment removes confusion, and without confusion, control becomes much harder to maintain. This is also why narcissists often accuse emotionally clear people of being cold, distant, uncaring. Because clarity creates emotional boundaries, and boundaries reduce emotional access. But narcissists often interpret reduced access as loss of control. That's why they frequently escalate emotionally during separation phases. Suddenly, they become softer, more vulnerable, more emotionally expressive. And after long periods of confusion, that emotional clarity feels powerful, almost irresistible, because your nervous system has been starving for consistency. So when they suddenly communicate clearly, even temporarily, it feels meaningful, like proof of transformation. But here's what most people realize too late. Temporary emotional clarity doesn't erase long-term emotional patterns, and narcissistic patterns usually return once emotional certainty is restored again. That's why the cycle repeats so often, because confusion disappears briefly, then slowly returns. At first, things feel calmer, safer, more emotionally stable, but eventually, the mixed signals begin again. The emotional unpredictability begins again. the subtle manipulation begins again. Because confusion itself was never accidental. It was functional. And functional confusion keeps people emotionally dependent. That's why many survivors eventually describe narcissistic relationships the same way. I felt emotionally addicted. And addiction is the perfect word for it. Because addiction isn't always about pleasure. Sometimes addiction is about relief. Relief from uncertainty. Relief from emotional withdrawal. Relief from confusion. That's why narcissistic relationships feel so psychologically consuming. Your nervous system becomes trapped in cycles of emotional tension and temporary emotional release. And over time, your identity starts disappearing inside the cycle. You become hyper-focused on managing emotional instability, trying to predict moods, prevent distance, restore closeness, and eventually, you stop asking one critical question: why does love feel this psychologically exhausting? That question changes everything. Because healthy love doesn't require constant emotional decoding. Healthy love doesn't force you to analyze every interaction for hidden meaning. Healthy love creates emotional clarity more often than confusion. But narcissistic dynamics survive through emotional imbalance. Because imbalance creates dependency, and dependency creates control. That's why narcissists often become uncomfortable when relationships start becoming emotionally stable. Stability reduces emotional intensity, and emotional intensity is what many narcissists associate with connection. That's why calm relationships often feel boring to them over time. Because calm relationships don't create the same psychological stimulation. So subconsciously, they recreate instability again. Distance, withdrawal, confusion, conflict. Because chaos restores emotional focus, and emotional focus restores control. But here's the realization that finally breaks the cycle. The narcissist didn't need you emotionally fulfilled. They needed you emotionally engaged. And confusion creates engagement extremely effectively. Because confused people stay emotionally invested, trying harder, thinking harder, feeling harder. But clarity changes everything. Because clarity ends emotional chasing. The moment you stop trying to solve the confusion, the attachment begins weakening. That's why awareness feels so transformative after narcissistic abuse. Suddenly, the relationship stops looking mysterious. It starts looking patterned, predictable, strategic. And once patterns become visible, their emotional power weakens dramatically. Now you stop asking, what did they really feel? And start asking, why did confusion become the center of the relationship? That question exposes the entire dynamic. Because relationships built on confusion often survive through instability, not intimacy. And once you understand that, their behavior stops feeling romantic. It starts feeling psychologically manipulative. Even when the manipulation was subtle, even when it looked emotional, even when part of them genuinely felt attached to you. Because attachment alone doesn't automatically create healthy love. And narcissistic attachment often centers around emotional access, not emotional safety. That's why the relationship felt so destabilizing. You were trying to build emotional security inside a cycle that depended on uncertainty. And uncertainty can never create lasting peace. That's why healing changes everything psychologically. Because eventually, you stop needing emotional answers from them. You stop chasing clarity from the source of confusion itself. And once that happens, the entire cycle collapses. Because now, You're no longer emotionally trapped inside the questions. You see the pattern clearly, the mixed signals, the inconsistency, the emotional push and pull, the confusion designed to keep you emotionally engaged. And once you see that clearly, something powerful happens. You stop interpreting confusion as depth. You stop mistaking emotional chaos for connection. You stop confusing obsession with love. And that's when real emotional freedom begins. Because now, you understand something that changes your entire life. The narcissist didn't want you emotionally secure. They wanted you emotionally uncertain. Because uncertain people stay attached longer, but emotionally clear people eventually walk away. And that is what narcissists fear most.